The photograph shows a man in his early 50s, jaw thrust forward in that characteristic pose of manufactured defiance, chest puffed out beneath a military uniform, heavy with medals he never earned in combat. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the leader of fascist Italy, stands beside Adolf Hitler at one of their many wartime conferences. Hitler looks on with barely concealed irritation. By 1941, the German Führer has realized what many in his high command already knew. Italy is not the powerful military ally that Mussolini's bombastic propaganda promised. Italy is a liability, a millstone around Germany's neck, dragging the Wehrmacht into theaters of war that Hitler never wanted to fight in. Mussolini declared that he would create a new Roman Empire, that Italian soldiers would march to glory across the Mediterranean and Africa. Instead, Italian forces suffered defeat after defeat, humiliation after humiliation, until the pattern became unmistakable. Italy could not win battles without German help, and often could not win even with German help. To understand how Italy became such a spectacular military failure requires going back to the beginning, to the man who created fascist Italy and convinced himself and many others that he was destined for greatness. Benito Mussolini was born in 1883 in a small town in northern Italy. His father was a blacksmith and a socialist, his mother a schoolteacher. Young Benito absorbed his father's radical politics, but added his own twist of nationalism and violence. He became a journalist, a socialist agitator, a man who lived by his words and his willingness to fight. When World War I broke out, Mussolini broke with the Socialist Party over the issue of Italian intervention. The socialists opposed the war. Mussolini came to support it, believing that war would bring about revolutionary change and that Italy needed to fight to claim its place among the great powers. Mussolini served in the Italian army during World War I and was wounded when a grenade launcher exploded during training, leaving him with shrapnel wounds. He spent the rest of the war recovering and agitating for a more aggressive prosecution of the war effort. Italy did fight on the winning side, joining the Allies and fighting Austria-Hungary, but the war was a nightmare for the Italian army. The battles along the Isonzo River were bloodbaths of trench warfare. Italian soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands in offensives that gained nothing. The disaster at Caporetto in 1917 saw the Italian army routed, losing 300,000 men as prisoners. Italy finished the war technically victorious but exhausted, impoverished, and angry. The post-war years in Italy were chaotic. The economy was in ruins. Unemployment was rampant. Labor strikes and socialist agitation seemed to threaten revolution. The government appeared weak and unable to maintain order. Into this chaos stepped Mussolini with a new movement, Fascism. The fascists took their name from the fasces, the bundle of rods with an axe that had been a symbol of authority in ancient Rome. Mussolini promised to restore Italian greatness, to crush the socialists, to make the trains run on time, to bring order through strength. His followers, the Blackshirts, were thugs and street fighters who beat up socialists, broke strikes, and terrorized opponents. The Italian establishment, terrified of socialism and communism, looked at Mussolini as a lesser evil, someone who could restore order. In October 1922, Mussolini organized the March on Rome. Thousands of Blackshirts converged on the capital, demanding power. The government could have stopped them easily with the army, but King Victor Emmanuel III refused to declare martial law. Instead, he invited Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini became prime minister, and over the next few years, he systematically dismantled Italian democracy. Opposition parties were banned. The press was censored. Political opponents were arrested, beaten, or killed. By 1925, Mussolini had established a dictatorship, and he styled himself Il Duce, the leader. Mussolini's ideology was a strange mixture of nationalism, militarism, and pseudo-revolutionary rhetoric. He glorified war as the ultimate test of a nation's virility. He spoke constantly about recreating the Roman Empire, about Italian soldiers marching across the Mediterranean like Roman legions. He built monuments, held massive rallies, and created a cult of personality around himself. The propaganda presented Mussolini as a superman, an athlete, a pilot, a swordsman, a man of action. Photographs showed him shirtless, harvesting wheat, riding horses, flying planes. He was always in motion, always vigorous, always dominating. The reality was quite different. By the late 1930s, when the events that would lead to World War II were accelerating, Mussolini was in his early 50s. Despite the propaganda images, he was not in particularly good physical condition. He suffered from various health problems, including stomach ulcers. His weight fluctuated, though he was obsessed with appearing strong and youthful. More importantly, his understanding of military matters was superficial at best. He had served in World War I, but he had never commanded troops in battle. He had never studied military strategy or logistics in any systematic way. He knew how to talk about war, how to strike martial poses, how to deliver speeches about Italian glory, but he did not understand what modern warfare actually required, and Italy was not prepared for modern warfare. The Italian economy was weak, far weaker than Germany's, and incomparably weaker than Britain's or America's. Italian industry could not produce the vast quantities of tanks, planes, ships, and weapons that modern war required. Italy lacked critical raw materials. It had virtually no oil, no rubber, limited coal, and insufficient steel production. Italian technology lagged behind the other major powers. Italian tanks were undergunned and underarmored. Italian aircraft were often obsolete. The Italian Navy had some good ships, but lacked aircraft carriers and suffered from inadequate fuel supplies and poor coordination with the Air Force. The Italian army itself was poorly prepared. Training was inadequate. Equipment was often old and poorly maintained. The officer corps was bloated with aristocrats and political appointees who lacked competence. Logistics, the unglamorous but essential work of supplying armies with food, ammunition, fuel, and spare parts, was a disaster. Italian generals thought in terms of World War I, of infantry charges and artillery barrages, not the mobile armored warfare that Germany would demonstrate. Morale was questionable. Italian soldiers were often peasants or workers who had no particular enthusiasm for Mussolini's dreams of empire. They would fight when properly led, and when the situation was not hopeless, but they were not fanatics willing to die for the fascist cause. Mussolini was aware of some of these problems, but he convinced himself that Italian spirit and will would overcome material deficiencies. He believed his own propaganda. He thought that the dynamic fascist system would prove superior to decadent democracies, and that Italian soldiers would fight with Roman courage. He was catastrophically wrong, but he would not realize the full extent of his delusions until Italy was already deep into military disaster. Mussolini wanted to be an equal partner, a fellow dictator leading his nation to glory. He envied Hitler's successes when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, when it absorbed Austria in 1938, when it took Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939. Mussolini watched with a mixture of admiration and jealousy. He wanted victories of his own to match Hitler's. In 1935 and 1936, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations left in Africa. The war was brutal. Italy used poison gas and aerial bombardment against poorly armed Ethiopian forces. Italy eventually won, and Mussolini proclaimed the rebirth of the Roman Empire. King Victor Emmanuel III was declared Emperor of Ethiopia. But the victory was hollow. The conquest of Ethiopia earned Italy international condemnation and sanctions from the League of Nations. It cost far more than it was worth economically, and it demonstrated that even against an African nation armed mostly with rifles, the Italian military struggled. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and Mussolini saw another opportunity for glory. He sent Italian troops, aircraft, and weapons to support Francisco Franco's nationalist forces against the Republican government. Italy's intervention in Spain was significant. Italian aircraft bombed Republican cities. Italian troops fought in several battles, but the results were mixed at best. At the Battle of Guadalajara in March 1937, Italian forces were defeated by Republican troops that included Italian anti-fascist volunteers. The propaganda value of this defeat, Italians fighting Italians with the fascist Italians losing, was terrible. The Spanish Civil War dragged on until 1939, and while Franco eventually won with German and Italian help, Italy's performance was not impressive. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and started World War II, Mussolini faced a dilemma. Hitler had not consulted him about the invasion. Mussolini found out about it like everyone else. He was annoyed but also calculating. He knew Italy was not ready for a major war. Italian generals told him the military needed several more years to prepare. Stockpiles were inadequate. Training was incomplete. Equipment was insufficient. So Mussolini declared non-belligerence, a term that meant Italy would not fight but would support Germany diplomatically. He promised Hitler that Italy would enter the war when the time was right. That time came in June 1940. Germany had conquered Poland in weeks. Then in April and May 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, then launched the Great Offensive in the west, smashing through the Low Countries and France. The French army, supposedly one of the best in the world, collapsed. The British evacuated from Dunkirk. France was on the verge of surrender. It looked to Mussolini like the war was almost over, and that Germany had already won. If Italy did not join now, it would miss out on the spoils of victory. Mussolini declared war on France and Britain on June 10, 1940. He expected a short war, a few easy victories, and a seat at the table when the victors divided up the British and French empires. France surrendered on June 22, 1940, and Italy's contribution to the victory was negligible. Italian forces had launched an offensive into southern France and made minimal gains against French troops who were fighting a delaying action while most of the French army was collapsing in the north. Italian casualties were embarrassingly high for the tiny amount of territory gained. But Mussolini got a piece of France in the armistice, a small occupation zone along the border. More importantly, he could claim to be one of the victors. He now set his sights on greater prizes. Mussolini's strategic vision, to the extent he had one, focused on the Mediterranean. He called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, a Roman term. He wanted to dominate the Mediterranean, to control North Africa, to seize Egypt and the Suez Canal from Britain, to conquer British territories in East Africa, perhaps to take Gibraltar and close the western entrance to the Mediterranean. He imagined Italian armies sweeping across the desert like ancient Roman legions, Italian warships controlling the sea, Italian aircraft ruling the skies. It was a grandiose fantasy divorced from Italian capabilities. The first major test came in North Africa. Italy had 2 colonies in North Africa, Libya, and Italian East Africa, which included Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland. Britain had Egypt, which was technically independent but effectively a British protectorate, and British Somaliland on the coast of East Africa. In September 1940, Italian forces in Libya, under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, invaded Egypt. The force was substantial, over 200,000 men, far outnumbering the British forces in Egypt. But Graziani advanced cautiously. He moved about 60 miles into Egypt and then stopped and built a series of fortified camps. He did not advance further. He cited supply difficulties, lack of transport, and the need to consolidate. The British, under General Archibald Wavell, were outnumbered but not intimidated. In December 1940, British and Commonwealth forces launched Operation Compass, what was intended as a large-scale raid. The results were stunning. British forces smashed through the Italian defences. Italian troops surrendered in droves. The British advanced rapidly, pushing the Italians out of Egypt and then pursuing them deep into Libya. By February 1941, the British had advanced over 500 miles, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and captured 130,000 prisoners. Italian losses included 380 tanks and 845 artillery pieces. British casualties were minimal, about 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. It was a catastrophic defeat for Italy, and it revealed the fundamental weakness of the Italian military. Why did the Italians lose so badly? The reasons were multiple. Italian equipment was inferior. Italian tanks were lightly armored and armed with machine guns or small-caliber guns that could not penetrate British tanks. British Matilda tanks were heavily armored and nearly invulnerable to Italian anti-tank weapons. Italian artillery was often old and lacked range. Italian logistics were poor. Supply lines were overextended, and Italian units often lacked food, water, ammunition, and fuel. Italian leadership was incompetent. Graziani was a brutal colonial general who had used poison gas in Ethiopia but had no aptitude for mechanized warfare. His defensive dispositions were poor. His units were spread out in isolated camps that could be defeated in detail. But the most fundamental problem was morale. Italian soldiers had little enthusiasm for the war. They were not fighting for their homes or their survival. They were fighting for Mussolini's imperial ambitions in a desert far from Italy. When British forces attacked with determination and superior equipment, many Italian soldiers decided that surrender was preferable to death. Officers often surrendered without serious resistance. Entire units gave up after token fighting. The British found themselves overwhelmed by the number of prisoners. Stories circulated, some true and some exaggerated, of Italian soldiers being relieved to be captured, of prisoners asking for food and water and thanking the British for rescuing them from the desert and the war. Mussolini was humiliated. His vision of Italian armies conquering Egypt had collapsed into a rout. But worse was to come, because Mussolini had opened another front, and this one would prove even more disastrous. In October 1940, Mussolini decided to invade Greece. His motives were mixed. He was jealous of Hitler's conquests and wanted victories of his own. Greece was a small country that should, in theory, be easy to defeat. Control of Greece would give Italy bases in the Balkans and threaten British positions in the eastern Mediterranean. Mussolini made the decision without extensive planning and without consulting Hitler, partly because he wanted to present the invasion of Greece as a fait accompli to show Hitler that Italy could act independently and successfully. The invasion was launched from Italian-occupied Albania on October 28, 1940. It was a disaster from the start. The Italian army had about 155,000 men for the invasion. The Greeks mobilized quickly and fought with determination. Greek troops knew the mountainous terrain. They were fighting for their homeland. They had good morale and competent leadership. The Italian offensive quickly stalled. Within weeks, the Greeks counterattacked and pushed the Italians back. By November, Greek forces had advanced into Albania and were pushing the Italians back toward the Albanian coast. The Italian army, which was supposed to be conquering Greece, was instead fighting to avoid being pushed into the sea. Mussolini was furious. He sacked his commander and sent reinforcements, but nothing worked. The Greek army continued to advance. Italian casualties mounted. The winter of 1940 to 1941 in the Albanian mountains was brutal. Italian soldiers, many of them from southern Italy and unprepared for harsh winter conditions, froze in the mountains. Frostbite casualties were as high as combat casualties. Supplies were inadequate. The roads were poor. Italian officers proved unable to cope with mountain warfare against a determined enemy. By March 1941, the situation had stabilized somewhat, but only because both sides were exhausted. The Greeks held a large part of Albania, and the Italian army had suffered about 150,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or frostbitten, for no gain whatsoever. The disaster in Greece was arguably worse than the disaster in North Africa because it was more public and more humiliating. Italy was supposed to be a great power. Greece was a small Balkan country. The fact that Greece not only stopped the Italian invasion but pushed into Italian territory made Italy look ridiculous. Jokes circulated. What is the shortest book in the world? The book of Italian war heroes. What do you call an Italian tank? A portable pillbox, because it has 4 gears in reverse and 1 forward in case the enemy attacks from behind. The jokes were cruel, but they reflected a reality. Italian military performance was a joke. Hitler was not amused. The Greek campaign was forcing his hand. Britain had sent forces to Greece to support the Greeks. This meant British bombers could potentially reach the Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, which Germany desperately needed. More importantly, Hitler had been planning to invade the Soviet Union in May 1941, and he could not leave his southern flank in chaos with British forces in Greece and the Italians being defeated. Hitler made the decision to intervene. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. The German forces, vastly superior to the Greeks and British, conquered both countries in a matter of weeks. Yugoslavia surrendered on April 17th. Greece surrendered on April 30th. The British evacuated their forces, losing most of their equipment. Germany had saved Italy from complete disaster in the Balkans, but at a cost. The campaign in Greece delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, by several weeks. Some historians argue that this delay was critical, that it meant German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941 just as winter set in, and that if the invasion had started on schedule in May, Moscow might have fallen. This is debatable, but what is certain is that Hitler was forced to divert resources and attention to fixing Mussolini's mess. Hitler never fully forgave Mussolini for the Greek adventure. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the situation deteriorated further for Italy. After the British victories in early 1941, Hitler sent German forces to Libya to prevent a complete Italian collapse. The Afrika Korps, under General Erwin Rommel, arrived in February 1941. Rommel was aggressive and competent, everything that Italian commanders were not. He launched an offensive in March and pushed the British back, recapturing much of the territory that the Italians had lost. For the next year and a half, the North African campaign swung back and forth across the Libyan desert, with Rommel winning battles but never quite achieving a decisive breakthrough. But the Afrika Korps was a German force, and while Italian units fought alongside them, everyone knew who was really in charge. Rommel often had contempt for his Italian allies. He found Italian commanders timid and Italian troops unreliable. To be fair to the Italians, they were often poorly supplied and equipped compared to the Germans. German units received priority for fuel, ammunition, and food. Italian units made do with what was left. Italian soldiers fighting in North Africa often performed adequately when they were properly supplied and led, but those conditions were rare. The Italian divisions in North Africa became increasingly dependent on German support, German logistics, German armor, and German air cover. In East Africa, Italy faced another disaster. Italian forces in East Africa, about 250,000 troops, were cut off from Italy and surrounded by British territories. Starting in January 1941, British and Commonwealth forces, including troops from India, South Africa, and African colonies, launched a coordinated invasion of Italian East Africa from multiple directions. The campaign was remarkably successful. Italian resistance was patchy. Some Italian units fought hard, but many surrendered relatively quickly. By May 1941, British forces had captured Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. By November 1941, the last Italian forces in East Africa surrendered. Italy lost its entire East African empire, and over 200,000 Italian troops went into captivity. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, whom Italy had overthrown in 1936, was restored to his throne. Italy's attempt to build an East African empire had lasted less than 5 years and ended in complete defeat. The pattern was now unmistakable. Italy could not win battles without German help, and even with German help, Italian forces were a weakness rather than a strength. But Mussolini's ambitions were not exhausted. He insisted on sending Italian troops to participate in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler did not particularly want Italian troops on the Eastern Front, knowing their poor record, but Mussolini demanded the right to participate in what he was certain would be a quick and glorious victory over communism. So, an Italian expeditionary force, initially about 62,000 troops, was sent to fight in southern Russia. The Italian troops in the Soviet Union were poorly equipped for the conditions. They lacked winter clothing, their weapons were inadequate, and their morale was low. They were fighting in a war that had nothing to do with Italian interests, in brutal conditions against an enemy that fought with fanatical determination. The Italian units were assigned to hold sections of the front, while German forces conducted offensives. In the summer of 1942, Mussolini sent reinforcements, bringing the Italian force up to about 230,000 men, organized as the Italian Eighth Army. In December 1942 and January 1943, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive, Operation Little Saturn, against the Axis forces along the Don River. The Italian Eighth Army, along with Hungarian and Romanian forces, was shattered. Soviet forces broke through, encircled Italian units, and destroyed them. The Italian Eighth Army essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 230,000 Italian troops sent to Russia, only about 115,000 returned to Italy, and many of those were wounded or frostbitten. The others were dead or prisoners. The survivors told stories of desperate retreats through the snow, of being overrun by Soviet tanks, of units simply disintegrating under pressure. It was yet another catastrophic defeat. By 1943, Italy was clearly losing the war. In North Africa, Rommel's forces were caught between British forces advancing from the east after the victory at El Alamein in November 1942, and American forces landing in Algeria and Morocco as part of Operation Torch. The Africa Corps and the remaining Italian forces in North Africa were pushed into Tunisia. They fought a delaying action through the winter and spring of 1943, but the end was inevitable. In May 1943, the last Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. About 250,000 Axis troops, including a large number of Italians, went into captivity. North Africa was lost. The next step for the Allies was obvious. With North Africa secured, they could invade southern Europe, and the obvious target was Italy itself. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The Italian and German forces on Sicily fought a defensive campaign, but they were outnumbered, and the outcome was not in doubt. By August 17th, Sicily had fallen to the Allies. The invasion of the Italian mainland was clearly next. The defeat in Sicily had political consequences. The Italian people were exhausted. Years of war, rationing, bombing, and defeats had destroyed support for Mussolini and the fascist regime. The Italian economy was collapsing. Food was scarce. The Allies were bombing Italian cities. People were dying. And for what? For Mussolini's dreams of empire that had brought nothing but disaster. On July 25, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council, the body of senior fascist officials, voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III, who had been a figurehead during the fascist period, dismissed Mussolini and had him arrested. A new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio took power and began secret negotiations with the Allies to take Italy out of the war. Mussolini's fall from power was the final humiliation. The man who had strutted and posed and promised to recreate the Roman Empire was arrested by his own government. He was imprisoned first in Rome, then moved to progressively more remote locations to prevent German rescue attempts. But Hitler was not willing to let his ally disappear. In September 1943, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny staged a daring raid and rescued Mussolini from his mountain prison. Hitler set Mussolini up as the puppet ruler of the Italian Social Republic, a rump state in northern Italy controlled by Germany. Mussolini would spend the last year and a half of his life as a powerless figurehead, watching as German forces fought in Italy and as the Allies advanced. Italy's surrender to the Allies was announced on September 8, 1943. It was supposed to be coordinated with Allied landings and a quick occupation of Italy, but the planning was poor. German forces in Italy, anticipating Italian betrayal, moved quickly to disarm Italian troops and seize control of the country. Some Italian units resisted and were massacred by the Germans. Others surrendered without a fight. The Italian navy sailed to Malta and surrendered to the Allies. The Italian army largely dissolved. Some soldiers went home. Some joined the Allies. Some joined the Germans and Mussolini's puppet republic. Italy descended into civil war, with Italian partisans fighting both the Germans and Mussolini's remaining fascist forces. The fighting in Italy continued until May 1945. Allied forces advanced slowly up the Italian peninsula against determined German resistance. The Germans fought a masterful defensive campaign, using Italy's mountainous terrain to slow the Allied advance. Mussolini, in his puppet republic in the north, had no real power. He gave speeches, issued decrees, and presided over a reign of terror against partisans and anyone suspected of disloyalty, but he was utterly dependent on German support. When Germany collapsed in April 1945, Mussolini's regime collapsed with it. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci were captured by Italian partisans as they tried to flee to Switzerland. The next day, April 28th, they were executed by firing squad. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down from a metal girder at a gas station in Piazzale Loreto. A crowd gathered and abused the bodies, spitting on them, throwing stones, mutilating them. It was a degrading end for a man who had dreamed of glory. So what can we conclude about Mussolini's military record and Italy's performance in World War II? The failures were comprehensive. Italy lost in North Africa, lost in East Africa, lost in Greece, lost in the Soviet Union, lost in Sicily, lost everywhere it fought unless rescued by German forces. The reasons for this failure operated at every level: strategic, operational, tactical, logistical, and moral. At the strategic level, Mussolini had no clear plan. He wanted glory and conquest, but had not thought through what Italy's war aims actually were or how to achieve them. He declared war on France and Britain when Germany seemed to be winning, expecting a short war and easy pickings. When Britain fought on, Italy was stuck in a war against an enemy with vastly superior resources. Italy's economy could not sustain a long war. Italian industry could not match British or American production. Italy depended on imports for oil, rubber, coal, and other critical resources, and the British Navy controlled the seas. Mussolini's dream of dominating the Mediterranean was impossible given the balance of forces. At the operational level, Italian commanders were largely incompetent. They had learned nothing from World War I or from observing German success in Poland and France. They thought in terms of static defense and infantry advances, not mobile warfare and combined arms operations. When they attempted offensives, they were cautious and slow. When they defended, they established poor positions and failed to create proper reserves. Italian logistics were terrible. Armies need food, water, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, and 1,000 other things. Italian supply lines were inadequate. Units in the field often lacked basic necessities. An army that is hungry and out of ammunition cannot fight effectively, no matter how brave the soldiers are. At the tactical level, Italian equipment was often inferior. Italian tanks were undergunned and underarmored. Italian aircraft were frequently obsolete. Italian weapons, artillery, and anti-tank guns lacked the power to compete with British or German equivalents. Italian soldiers were often poorly trained. Training takes time and resources, and Italy lacked both. Soldiers were rushed through basic training and sent to the front without adequate preparation for the realities of modern warfare. At the moral level, Italian soldiers lacked motivation. German soldiers, whatever we think of the Nazi regime they served, often fought with fanaticism born of ideological indoctrination and fear. Soviet soldiers fought for their homeland and their survival against an enemy bent on genocide. British and American soldiers fought for democracy and against fascist tyranny. What were Italian soldiers fighting for? Mussolini's personal ambitions? The conquest of deserts and mountains far from Italy? The recreation of an ancient Roman Empire that had died 1,500 years ago? These were not causes that inspired men to fight and die. When Italian soldiers faced death or captivity, many chose captivity. This was not cowardice, it was rationality in the face of absurdity. The relationship between Mussolini and Hitler revealed the fundamental inequality between the two dictators and their nations. Mussolini wanted to be Hitler's equal, to stand beside him as a fellow conqueror. Hitler initially respected Mussolini as a senior fascist leader, but as Italy's failures mounted, Hitler's respect turned to contempt. Hitler complained bitterly about Italy's military incompetence. He was forced repeatedly to divert German forces to rescue Italy from disasters of Mussolini's making. The invasions of Greece and Yugoslavia delayed Operation Barbarossa. The dispatch of the Africa Corps diverted forces that could have been used in Russia. The need to garrison Italy after 1943 tied down German divisions that could have been fighting on other fronts. Mussolini, who had dreamed of marching to glory beside Hitler, became a burden that Hitler dragged along until Italy finally collapsed. The irony is that Italy probably would have been better off staying out of the war entirely. If Mussolini had maintained non-belligerence, Italy could have traded with both sides, much like Spain under Franco did. Italy could have avoided the destruction of its cities by Allied bombing, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of its soldiers, the devastation of its economy, and the chaos of civil war. Instead, Mussolini's ambition and vanity led Italy into a war it could not win, for goals it could not achieve, against enemies it could not defeat. The result was national catastrophe. Italy's failures in World War II were not inevitable. Italy had a long military history. Italian soldiers had fought well in many wars. The problem was not the Italian people or the Italian soldier. The problem was fascism, and specifically Mussolini. Fascism elevated style over substance, propaganda over reality, posturing over planning. Mussolini's regime was built on bombast and bullying, on creating the appearance of strength through rallies and uniforms and rhetoric. But when tested in actual war against competent enemies, the hollowness of fascism was revealed. Italy's military was weak because fascism had prioritized loyalty over competence, showmanship over preparation, and ideology over practical reality. Mussolini himself embodied these failures. He was not stupid, but he was profoundly ignorant of military matters and refused to listen to those who knew better. He made critical decisions based on jealousy of Hitler, on impulse, on the need to appear strong and decisive. He invaded Greece on a whim, without proper planning, because he wanted a quick victory to match Hitler's conquests. He sent Italian troops to Russia because he could not bear to be left out of what he thought would be Hitler's greatest triumph. He declared war on France and Britain in 1940 because he feared missing out on the spoils of victory. Every one of these decisions was catastrophically wrong, and every one stemmed from Mussolini's vanity and ignorance. The Italian people paid the price for Mussolini's failures. Over 300,000 Italian soldiers died in World War II. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded or taken prisoner. Italian cities were bombed. Italian families went hungry. The Italian economy was destroyed. And in the end, Italy was occupied by foreign armies, divided between Allied forces advancing from the south and German forces holding the north, and descended into civil war. When Mussolini's body hung from that girder in Milan, many Italians must have looked at it and thought about the catastrophe he had brought upon their country. The historical verdict on Mussolini is clear. He was a failure as a military leader, a failure as a strategist, and a failure as a statesman. His attempt to create a new Roman Empire resulted instead in national humiliation. His alliance with Hitler dragged Italy into a war it could not win and did not need to fight. His military adventures ended in disaster after disaster, requiring German rescue again and again until Germany itself collapsed and could no longer save him. The dictator who posed as a modern Caesar died as a traitor and a coward, executed by his own countrymen, and left to hang as a warning and a symbol of fascism's failure. Hitler's shock at Italian incompetence was genuine, but it was also partly his own fault. Hitler had encouraged Mussolini's fascist regime, had allied with him, and had treated him as an equal long after it was clear that Italy was the junior partner. Hitler needed to believe that fascism was a superior form of government, and Italy's failures undermined that belief. If fascist Italy, with its years of fascist rule and its claims of national rebirth, could not defeat Greece or stand without German help against Britain, what did that say about fascism? Hitler never fully confronted this question, but it must have troubled him, especially as Germany's own situation became increasingly desperate after 1943. The story of Mussolini and Italy in World War II is ultimately a story about the dangers of authoritarian leadership unmoored from reality. Mussolini created a system where no one could tell him the truth, where bad news was suppressed, where propaganda replaced honest assessment. He surrounded himself with sycophants and yes-men. He purged or sidelined competent people who might have challenged his fantasies. He believed his own rhetoric about Italian strength and destiny. When reality intruded in the form of military defeat, he blamed others, blamed inadequate supplies, blamed Italian cowardice, blamed everything except his own failed leadership. This pattern repeats throughout history. Dictators who insulate themselves from truth, who prioritize loyalty over competence, who believe their own propaganda, tend to lead their countries to disaster. Mussolini is a particularly clear example because the contrast between his propaganda and reality was so stark. The propaganda showed a dynamic leader creating a powerful military machine. The reality was a vain, ignorant man leading a poorly equipped, badly led, demoralized military into one defeat after another. The propaganda showed Italian soldiers marching to glory. The reality was Italian soldiers surrendering in droves or dying in frozen mountains far from home. The propaganda showed Italy as a great power, a new Rome. The reality was Italy as Germany's weakest ally, a liability that Hitler had to repeatedly rescue. The lessons from Italy's World War II experience are relevant beyond military history. They speak to the importance of honest assessment, of competent leadership, of building systems based on reality rather than fantasy. They speak to the dangers of charismatic authoritarianism, where one man's ego and ignorance can doom an entire nation. They speak to the difference between appearing strong through propaganda and pageantry, and actually being strong through sound planning, adequate resources, competent leadership, and genuine morale. Mussolini mastered the former. He failed completely at the latter, and the Italian people, and ultimately Mussolini himself, paid the price. When we look at that photograph of Mussolini standing beside Hitler, jaw jutted out, chest puffed up, medals gleaming, we should see not strength, but delusion. We should see a man who convinced himself he was a military genius when he was nothing of the kind. We should see a man who led his country into a war it could not win because his vanity would not let him accept Italy's limitations. We should see a man whose legacy is not the Roman Empire reborn, but rather hundreds of thousands of dead Italian soldiers, destroyed cities, a devastated economy, and a nation torn apart by civil war. That is Mussolini's true legacy, and that is what Hitler came to understand with increasing bitterness as Italy's defeats mounted and German forces had to be diverted again and again to prop up Mussolini's failing regime. The Italian military's performance in World War II stands as one of history's clearest examples of how propaganda and posturing cannot substitute for actual military capability. Mussolini had 20 years to build his military, 20 years of fascist rule to prepare Italy for the wars he constantly promised. The result was a military that could not defeat Greece, could not hold North Africa without German help, could not achieve a single significant victory without German intervention. This was not because Italians were inherently bad soldiers. It was because fascism had created a system that valued appearance over reality, that promoted based on political loyalty rather than competence, that spent resources on spectacle rather than substance. The Italian military looked impressive in parades. It performed terribly in battle, and that gap between appearance and reality cost hundreds of thousands of Italian lives and destroyed Mussolini's dreams of empire before they had barely begun.